I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but truly discussing a global issue. It's a stripped-down, wartime conditions kind of broadcast, this one, because of the British government's laws on social distancing. We've had to lose our audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. But I am joined by three very important guests in the studio, suitably distanced, and some Skype interviews of very rare value. We're talking, of course, about the coronavirus, as we did with sensational effect in our last episode, which has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of viewers all over the world. But this time, we're dealing with the extent to which the United States empire is actually weaponizing the pandemic in order to try and hasten regime change amongst their favorite enemies, particularly Iran, but also Venezuela, and maybe one or two other places now heaving into view as potential targets now that everyone's defenses are down, or rather the defenses are up but facing in the direction of trying to defeat this pandemic, which is creating havoc across the world. Mass deaths, enormous levels of sickness, a virus which is extraordinarily virulent and, it would appear so far, unusually fatal as viruses go. Now, you might think that this is hyperbole. After all, the United States is the worst affected country in the whole world. The death rate, the rate of infections, the inability to even provide the most basic health care in many states of the United States, particularly in the epicenter of New York, is such that they can't possibly, can they, still be using their resources, their money, their time, their soldiers, their sailors, and their airmen to try and bring about regime change elsewhere. It is a truly extraordinary thing that all of that, I'm afraid, is true. The United States has doubled down its efforts to destabilize and overthrow, if they can, the governments that they hate across the world. Now, of course, there's more than one way of making war, just as there's more than one way, as we say in England, to skin a cat. It's not the intention, I think, though Donald Trump's tweets sometimes make you wonder, that they should attack Iran. But they are quarantining Iran in the worst possible sense of the word. It is a total embargo. They have doubled down on their sanctions on a country gravely affected by the coronavirus sickness. And when the voices began to rise around the world, even from Boris Johnson's government, that's how bad it is, they turned their face away from any relief of the sanctions regime on Iran because of the coronavirus. They made an offer to Venezuela, well, we'll lift the sanctions on you for the period of the epidemic, but only if President Maduro shares power with the phantom Juan Guaido, the United States puppet appointee. They haven't made that kind of offer to Iran, presumably because they know that it would be laughed out of court, not just in Iran, but around the world. So are the sanctions actually assisting the transfer from person to person of this horrific virus in Iran? And is that the United States' intention? Or is it, as Mike Pompeo and indeed the British Foreign Office say that actually the sanctions are not harming the effort against the coronavirus epidemic in Iran. And insofar as Iran is unduly suffering, they say it's because of inefficiency, incompetence, and even corruption within the political leadership and system in Iran. Which of these two alternate versions of fact is in fact true? Brother, you're an expert on Iran. Is sanctioning Iran during a pandemic actually a war crime?
Thank you very much, George. In these sort of extraordinary circumstances, to be sitting here and talking with you on this particular issue. Insofar as expert is concerned, I think only Almighty is the expert on anything.
You're a good student then.
I'm a humble student of Iran, perhaps even less knowledgeable than you are on that particular issue. With that preamble, I think there are two things that one's got to look at. When one is talking about the inefficiency, the corruption and mismanagement of this particular crisis in Iran, I think in your sort of opening comments, you alluded to how inefficient, incompetent and corrupt the US
a very good point.
Management
it
has been.
Really is the pot calling the kettle black.
Indeed. And not only that, there's a war going on between the president, the governors and the sort of, the other political leaders in the USA, the mayor of New York, the governor of New York, they've all been sort of saying that, Mr. Trump, you really don't know what you're doing.
And in fact, they're at war with each other. The mayor of New York City is at war with the governor of the state of New York.
Indeed.
They're rivals, you know.
Indeed.
Some things never get put down, even in an emergency.
So when one talks about, the unity of purpose, this particular crisis is actually showing, and this is perhaps, you might come later on, is the failing of the whole capitalist system. The way the whole medical system, the whole sort of approach to money printing that's taking place in the USA is going to come home to roost very quickly, because we've had crisis upon crisis of the capitalist system just in the last 20 years, if you like. We had the tech bubble bursting at the turn of the millennium. Then 10 years later, you had the housing bubble, the financial crisis, and 10 years later, you've got this particular situation. So I think the malaise, the virus of the capitalist system itself is coming home for people to realize. And I think, I dislike quoting American presidents, but on this particular occasion, I think it's probably appropriate. Roosevelt quite sort of eloquently put it that the biggest fear that mankind has is fear itself. And I think the ruling elite, or what Brother Mohsin likes to call the power elite, the structural elite, are really creating that fear in all of us, whether we are believers, secular or unbelievers, to really fear in such a way that our immune system becomes weak. And this is not me. Scientists and a lot of other specialists are saying that as soon as you start fearing something, your immune system becomes weaker. And this weakness of the immune system attacks this virus more virulently than if your immune system is bigger. So my message to your viewers, firstly, is not to fear. What is going to happen is going to happen. And if one is a believer, death is going to come to all of us one way or another. Whether it's corona, whether it's HIV, whether it's car accident, heart attack, multiple other deaths may occur. But to fear is what I think the ruling elite wants us to. And as you know, all over the world, whether it's Bolsonaro or Orbán or the Philippines leader saying that if anyone comes out, they're going to shoot them. So they want to frighten the people in such a cocoon.
Why? Why do they want to frighten people? Why would capitalism want to frighten people to stay home and not spend money on their goods and services?
That's an interesting question, because in 2-3 months' time, if people are not dying of the coronavirus, they'll be dying of hunger in poorer countries. Therefore, they can come out with other strategies. And these are not conspiracy theories I'm talking
They
about.
sound a bit conspiracy theory to me.
Possibly. But quite often conspiracy theories 20 years later, 40
Turn
years
out
later.
to be orthodoxy, yes.
Absolutely.
Let's go to Syed Mohsin, as you mentioned him. Let's stick to this first question. Is it a war crime to be doubling down on sanctions on Iran when it is in such a parlous place, though not nearly as parlous as the United States itself in terms of the coronavirus?
I think it is a war crime. I think any humanitarian gesture, any moral code that I know of would, I think, designate this as an inhumane act, certainly. If you're seeing somebody is dying or suffering, to kick them while they're in that position is reprehensible, it's deplorable. I think that the Americans, D.H. Lawrence put it quite interestingly. He said at the heart of American psyche, there is a violence DNA that's locked in. He quoted that basically there's something within the American psyche as a whole. And he's not talking about just the government. There's an acceptance of death, violence of that kind. And perhaps that's what's been taken advantage of by the people in power. They know that people are ambivalent to people dying abroad. It's more important to them if somebody dies in their vicinity, but actually if people are dying en masse in foreign fields, it doesn't matter. That's a kind of worrying moral ambivalence which is there within a lot of societies, but America is definitely there. They're very isolated in that sense, very self-centered. The other thing that worries me is that people talk about the morality of Donald Trump. I mean, this was a question that's actually been raised. Is it morally right for America to double down on what they've been doing to the Iranians? Because they've sanctioned 20 more individuals. They've targeted people who were supposed to be linked, supposedly, to Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. They've increased all of the sanctions on every level. Anybody else that's going to deal with Iran, even if it's medical supplies to that country, is still liable to be sanctioned by the Americans. So the issue is asking Trump whether he's got a moral conscience about dealing with Iranians or killing Iranians with these kind of economic sanctions and this pandemic-based economic sanctions is really a bit like asking a fox whether it feels guilty about eating some chickens in the pen.
We'll come back to that. Look, earlier I spoke by Skype to a man on the front line, Dr. Foad Izadi, who is a lecturer at the University of Tehran in public diplomacy, in United States foreign policy, and in Iran, United States relations. So he's got a lot on his plate for sure. Let's take a look at what he had to say. Now, the US claims that food and medicine are not included in the sanctions and therefore cannot be responsible for the health situation in Iran. What do you say to that?
Well, the answer is not very complicated. We have two problems. One, the items that Iran needs to buy from outside, whether it's medicine or medical equipment, Iran needs to pay for these items. And because of the banking sanctions, not humanitarian sanctions, banking sanctions, Iran is not able to pay for the items that Iran needs to buy. And the result is that Iran cannot get medicine or medical equipment or food or other things that are not officially sanctioned, but still a country that needs these items need to pay for it. And because of the banking sanctions, Iran cannot pay. So that's one problem. The second problem is that for companies to deal with Iran, they need to make sure that that transaction is not going to cause them difficulties. You know, if you're in business, you generally have 5%, 10%, at most 20% profit. So if you engage in a transaction that is going to cost you thousands or hundreds of thousands of attorney fee because the US government wants to sanction your company, you stay away from this type of transactions. And what the US government has done is that they have scared a lot of companies, and they have prohibited and warned them in terms of dealing with Iran. So companies don't want to take a chance, even companies that deal in medicine or medical equipment. So when the US talks about humanitarian aid to Iran, it's mostly propaganda, not to be taken seriously.
What about the American allegations of mismanagement, incompetence, even corruption as being much more responsible than sanctions themselves?
You know, I'm sure in any government, in any country, you would find mismanagement and occasionally corruptions. But from what we see in Iran is that the medical staff is working very hard. They are staying at their jobs, spending many, many hours like other people all over the world. So the people in medical professions, doctors, nurses, they're doing an excellent job. They are not doing any mismanagement. They're actually sacrificing their life. And people higher up in the Ministry of Health and other places are also working very hard. Do we have some people that are not probably doing a good job as much as they should? Probably yes. But that is going to be with any country anywhere in the world, including the United States. So what the US government says in this case is also propaganda more than truth.
Well, that was the voice from the front line. Shabbir, I was struck by the first point that he made, that we're not sanctioning humanitarian aid. You can buy food and medicines, but of course, with the banking sanctions, even if you had the money to buy them, you cannot actually complete the transaction. Why doesn't a single Western journalist ever ask that obvious point when Pompeo says there are no sanctions on medicine and food?
Well, Mr. Pompeo quite proudly has said that we lie, we cheat, and we steal.
He did, yes.
And not only did he say that, but if you see that clip, it's extraordinary that there was clapping.
I watch it every day.
There was clapping from the audience. Yes. So that shows what Brother Mohsin was earlier saying, that it's probably part of the American DNA to be belligerent, to kill other people. Why would a system survive if the mass of the people were against it? So coming back to your question on the banking system itself, look, for the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 2-3 years, the whole banking system has been put under chain by the USA. So your big players, whether it's HSBC or Deutsche Bank or any other Credit Suisse in France, they all have operations in New York. Therefore, they're frightened that if we transact any money for Iran through our banks, we'll be sort of penalized in a horrendous way. So they've shied away from it. And plus, as you well know, Iran has been out of the SWIFT system, which is the international transaction system for any business that takes place globally. If Iran is out of it, and Europe has promised for the last 2 years that they're going to put up some system, but it hasn't come about. So the reality is that Iran is not able to buy anything, because you don't go with a suitcase full of money to an exporter sitting in Frankfurt. You have to go through the banking system. If that is not available, then Iran can't really transact anything. So it's totally hypocritical, complete propaganda, and really eyewash.
Imagine that, the former head of the CIA lying about the sanctions on Iran. Robert Inlakesh, you're a journalist and broadcaster. How come the media, it's a question I just asked really, how come the media give the US political leaders such a free pass on this? It only a child could work out that, well, yes, but if we're not allowed to use the banking system, we can't buy anything at all of our needs. Do journalists know this and deliberately not ask it, in your opinion, or are they idiots?
Well, it's a little bit of both, if you ask my opinion. I mean, of course, to some extent, they should know what's happening in the world with their job. But if you look at it, really, they'll talk about petty politics, party politics, partisan politics, but they'll never get into the nitty-gritty. And when it comes to foreign policy, they never talk about what the United States is doing and engaging in overseas, and they've continued to cover up. For instance, now, why aren't they talking about this round-the-clock coverage of the coronavirus? Why aren't they not talking about the sanctions on Iran, the sanctions on Syria as well? We get a lot of reports about Syria, how that's going to affect the Syrian people when the virus hits hardest there. What about the Israelis and their persecution of the Palestinians ongoing in the West Bank, the bombardment of the Gaza Strip, the bombardment of Syria from Israel as well, breaking the global call for ceasefire, which came from the United Nations? We're not hearing about this. What about the situation in Yemen? We've had reports in Yemen from a minister in Yemen saying that the Saudis have been dropping infected masks, infected with the coronavirus itself, into the territory of Yemen. But we don't hear this reported. And why? Because it would out the United States and the way it
Can that really be true, that story?
I mean, well, it
sounds like a First World War propaganda horror story to me.
Yeah, it would sound that way, but we have to keep in mind that the Saudis have weaponized cholera, so it's not a far stretch of the imagination to believe that they would do something like it. I mention it because of the fact, and this is the very reason that I brought this up, is because in the past, the Saudis, and we had to remember the United States is behind the Saudis in their destruction of Yemen and killing of hundreds of thousands of people there, which we should not forget. All the people starving to death in Yemen, we don't want to talk about them. The media covers this up. You asked about the media. They cover this up largely. When hundreds of thousands of people were dying in Iraq because of the sanctions on Iraq, they covered it up. They didn't talk about it. They weren't wanting to talk about it. And when they did, they engaged in conversations with politicians who said that the price was something that they were willing to pay. I mean, you see the way that they work, and historically they've always worked with the empire. They've always endorsed these ideas of Orientalism, and they've never challenged the politicians on the core root issues. They only talk about surface level topics, things that are, gossip topics. They'll talk about the language that the president used, for instance, which is important if he's using racist language and stuff like that, of course, to call that out. But go further. What about the racist policies that he's imposing upon people all around the world, and the mentality that he has and how that feeds into his ideas when it comes to foreign policy? The people behind him, the neoconservatives who are pushing him into these wars, and the people that are backing him and have business ties with him, they don't talk about these issues. They talk about, like I said, the surface level issues, because that's stuff that people can easily digest, and it doesn't make them look deeper into the crimes of their own government.
The idea that the BBC could publish on its website that the United States had sent warships into the off the coast of Venezuela to fight the drug trade, when the dogs in the street know that the warships are off the coast of Venezuela to try and bring down the government of Venezuela. If I ever doubted that mainstream journalists were lying accomplices to empire, it died this week when I saw that BBC headline. We'll be right back with more of this. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, talking about American sanctions on Iran and asking the question, are sanctions during a pandemic actually a war crime? So far, the consensus here in the studio is that they indeed do. Now, earlier I spoke on the Skype to Dr. Kevin Barret, a PhD, an Arabist-Islamologist, one of America's best-known critics of the war on terror. He's the host of a radio show, a call-in show, and he's also appeared many times, even on Fox News. I was impressed. See if you are. Now, the US claims that food and medicine are not included in the sanctions, and therefore they cannot be blamed for the health situation in Iran. What do you say to that?
The fact is that the sanctions are preventing medicine and food from reaching Iran. The sanctions are operating through the international financial system, and Western corporations and even some corporations outside the West are afraid to risk the wrath of the sanctions regime by shipping anything to Iran. They know that there's a chance that they're going to be penalized. So this is clearly a case where the United States government, as usual, is giving us their distorted, propagandized version of reality. Well, the notion that the coronavirus problem in Iran is the fault of its government and alleged corruption and mismanagement is a joke coming from Trump administration officials who internationally have been viewed correctly as being among the clumsiest in terms of responding to this problem. That Trump is famous for tweeting something different about this every 10 minutes, it seems, and who knows whether he will finally decide to open up the country. So it's not really a matter of the response. It's possible. I don't know what the official response has been in Iran. From what I've seen, it looks pretty typical of most of the world. The one country that seems to have responded fairly expeditiously to this once they realized the scale of the crisis was China. And other countries, it's really all over the map. And I don't think blaming the governments is particularly relevant in any case. Even in the case of Trump, if we're going to blame Trump and the Trump administration, I think we would want to look a little deeper and ask ourselves whether the fanatical anti-Iran neoconservatives around Trump, the people loyal to Bibi Netanyahu, many of them are either the same people or at least from the same school of thought with the same associations as the people around Dick Cheney and George W. Bush in 2001, whether those people might be related to the COVID-19 problem in the same way that Cheney and the neocons were related to the anthrax problem. The fact is that anthrax was manufactured in Fort Detrick, the same place where the COVID-19 virus may have originated, according to the Chinese government. They say that it came to China from U.S. military athletes who were participating in the World Games. And in fact, those athletes had been training right next door to Fort Detrick, which had been closed for all kinds of security problems previous summer. Fort Detrick also is, again, the site where the U.S. government even admits that the anthrax that shut down Congress and allowed Congress to immediately pass the Patriot Act after anthrax letters were sent to the very U.S. senators who were leading the fight against the Patriot Act, Tom Daschle, Patrick Leahy, and my own Senator Russ Feingold, that anthrax was made at Fort Detrick. The U.S. government admits it. It went after the wrong guy. They were not allowed to prosecute the people who really manufactured the anthrax. A certain Dr. Philip Zach is the leading suspect. So today we're in a situation where the very people who manufactured the anthrax that was used to push through the Patriot Act are the top suspects in setting loose this pandemic. Naturally, Iran is not going to be happy about this. Naturally, the official position of much of the government of Iran, including the supreme leader, is that this has to be viewed as U.S. biological warfare.
Syed Mohsin, you think that's fair or too strong? U.S. biological warfare. There is increasing, I won't say speculation, but questioning of the original narrative that this came from a wet market in Wuhan. It seems to have come a long way, if that's what it was. The fact that the military games were in Wuhan just weeks before the outbreak in Wuhan, and that the American team in the World Military Games were based at the very place where the United States has now closed its biological weapons laboratory. I mean, I don't want to be Sherlock Holmes, but you'd have to say that was an interesting set of coordinates, wouldn't you?
Yeah, a lot of, if you like, coincidences seem to be conversing on this issue of coronavirus. Clearly, people are more concerned about being safe than sorry, surviving, and people have gone into that mode, and most of the media output has herded people towards, self-preservation primarily. But that doesn't mean that we should not ask questions. It's really important at this stage that we don't forget that there has to be an origin to this. What's fascinating is nobody has found, if you like, patient zero. And it's really quite extraordinary that we can't track down where this thing actually originated. The Chinese have confirmed that the first 41 cases do not, of them at least 15, do not have any connection to that wet market, which they generally was claimed. And it's still being pumped out by American and media agencies and others that actually it's a Chinese virus. So we know that they've already weaponized.
Well, after all, the famous Spanish flu, which killed 50 million people at the end of the First World War, actually came from Texas, had nothing to do with Spain, with the Spanish at all.
I mean, and what people have to really ask in this situation is the kind of leaderships we've allowed to emerge and evolve in a very sort of ambivalent manner into power, the likes of Donald Trump. What you've got to ask yourself is, do you have trust in them? The psychopathic and sociopathic nature of Donald Trump and the likes of Pompeo is on record. What else is going on in the background? We have no control over what really goes on at that level.
No, not even Parliament. As you know, I sat in Parliament for almost 30 years, and you would never, as a member of Parliament, get anywhere near the true facts of what was going on, say, at the British germ warfare lab at Porton Down. You would never, if I turned up at the gate and said, I'm a member of the British Parliament, let me in, I want to see what you're doing, I'd be under arrest very quickly. So, yes, you're right, there's a deep state and so on. The one thing I would say, Shabbir, is if this was a biological weapon and it was deliberately taken to China, well, it's the biggest boomerang in history, because the United States has now lost far more people than China, and it's only just begun in the United States.
It's not only a boomerang. Viruses do not stay in one place. Simple as that. So anyone in the power elite in USA thought that it would be confined to China was either living a delusional life.
Not fit to be called a scientist, that's for sure.
So absolutely. So this is the whole concept, and this metaphor which is so often used, coming home to roost. So the reality is that USA has inflicted all kinds of problems on this planet for the last 50 years, 100 years, whether it's economic problems created due to the global system failing, or the virus, or culture, or all kinds of other issues that America has inflicted on the world. Therefore, it will have to come home to roost, and America will feel the pain. And the reality is that the ordinary, whether they're white, black, or Hispanics in USA, are going to lose out at many levels. We will be facing a huge economic crisis globally. And who's going to pay for it? The ordinary people.
Well, there's already 10 million unemployed in America. It was 326,000 a month ago. And the Great Depression of the 1930s had an unemployment level in the United States of 25%. There's very shortly going to be more than 25% unemployed in the United States. What do you think about this? Do you think we're being unfair to the Americans? I mean, when I watch Donald Trump, he strikes me as having some good intentions, being somehow good at heart, but he is surrounded by cutthroats and murderers and thieves and lobbyists and funders and so on. I sometimes wonder if left to his better instincts, he'd be a better president. What do you think?
I believe that it's a bit of an illusion which is surrounding Donald Trump in the way that he acts. I mean, he'll go state to state, say different things, contradict himself constantly, and it's all, in my opinion, part of an act, and it's very carefully done. If you look at the circles that he's been included in for a very long time, he's rolled around with people who are at heart, neocons, people who are all of these, like people on Wall Street. He was bailed out by the bankers a number of times. The Rothschild family actually helped him when he was in financial trouble. So he's always been part of this elite, but he's maintained this image that he's not part of the elite. And your question about are we being too harsh to the Americans? I mean, if we look at everything the Americans have done just in the past 20 years all around the world, I don't think we're being harsh on the Americans. I mean, the Americans are the only ones, the United States is the only one to ever use an atomic bomb. It's the country which has been going around the world sanctioning countries that it doesn't agree with, killing its people, millions, exiling millions of people, creating de facto a refugee crisis. It's been the one that has been funding and backing Israel to do what it's been doing against the Palestinian people. I wouldn't include the American public as a large portion of them in this. I would say that the American government, the American authorities, these people are the ones to blame. And if you look at what they're doing around the world, I don't think we're being harsh on them at all. Would they create a biological weapon? Absolutely. Can I personally prove that 100% and say that as a fact? No, I can't. And as a journalist, I shouldn't say that I can absolutely prove that. But what I can say is that looking at what they've done historically, looking at what they are doing right now at this moment, would they create a biological weapon? Absolutely. Would they use it to kill it? Absolutely.
Many countries, if not all, have the ability to, and many have created biological weapons. Winston Churchill had laid in chemical and biological weapons right along the south coast of England in case Hitler arrived in 1940 in an existential moment. Any regime actually would use biological weapons. But you're right to say the American people is one thing and the state and its role is another. Let's listen to a conversation I had earlier with one of the finest of all Americans. She is one of the bravest people I've ever met. She's the founder, leader of Code Pink, Medea Benjamin. Let's hear what she had to say.
Yes, we're part of a coalition of many groups in the United States that have been fighting against these sanctions and urging the U.S. government to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. We've been pushing our elected representatives. We've been getting letters in Congress. We just had one signed by several dozen Congress people. We have been pushing Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, and we have been doing a lot of education of the American public to make them realize how brutal it is and how cruel it is in the midst of this pandemic to be making it even harder for the Iranian people to get the relief they need. The U.S. has always said that humanitarian aid was exempt, and it's always been a lie because the companies don't want to deal with Iran, the banks don't want to deal, the insurance companies, the shipping companies, because they don't want to incur the wrath of the United States. So it has always been a problem, and of course is now tremendously exacerbated with the coronavirus crisis.
What about the American allegations of mismanagement, incompetence, even corruption as being much more responsible than sanctions themselves?
Well, I don't know if you know the expression about calling the kettle black, but here in the United States, there has been tremendous mismanagement of this crisis. They're talking about millions of Americans dying. President Trump is accusing healthcare workers of stealing protective equipment. It is just crazy what's going on here in the United States. So this is certainly no time for the U.S. government to be talking about corruption and blaming the Iranian government. This is a time for us to work together as a global community to confront this global crisis.
How much awareness do you think there is in the United States about the situation in Iran under the coronavirus pandemic?
Most Americans have not been aware of what is going on in Iran because in the past, all they've heard about Iran is it's a #1 state sponsor of terror. It's not a normal country. It's horrible, this and that. But recently, there has been a lot of pressure on President Trump. So I think the American people are just starting to become aware about the inhumane results of the U.S. sanctions policy.
Shabbir Saab, what do you think of the Trump tweet that I referred to right at the beginning of the show when he said that we have information and belief that Iran or its proxies were about to make a sneak attack on American forces or assets. Is that another military attack on Iran, on Iraq?
Well, one never knows what's likely to happen. But as Robert was earlier saying, that the history of recent history is very clear that America is venturing or creating wars in the Middle East for a purpose, to really occupy those lands, to create more conflict, to balkanize Iraq, Syria, and possibly even Iran, because the main strategy is to have small nations that will not be able to stand up to Washington.
Which are ethnic and religiously based.
Absolutely.
It would suit them fine to have 3 Lebanons and 5 Iraqs.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely. So that's one strategy. Second aspect of what Mr. Trump says, and I'll have to, not to sound boring, but I think it's very, very important when Mr. Pompeo says that we lie, we cheat, and we steal. So everything that comes out of Washington, and you recall very easily, I think just before the Iraq war, Mr. Powell showed this small test tube saying that this is what Iraq has, and they will sort of inflict chemical weapons on us. And in Parliament, Mr. Blair at that time said in 45 minutes, Saddam can attack us. So there's a whole litany of lying, cheating, and stealing. Therefore, I really have no faith at all when any leader in Washington, London, or Paris says anything about the developing world or as to what's happening in the Middle East. And I think this is what we have to be cautious about when we listen about the coronavirus and the strategy behind what they're trying to do with Iran and Venezuela, that they are full of untruthful statements, and we really have to be awfully careful when we listen to them.
And yet, Robert, the opinion polls have got Donald Trump and Boris Johnson riding high. How's that?
Well, it just depends upon what sentiments they can tap into in the populations. I mean, in the past years, what we've seen is that the public have been exposed to different campaigns of whether it's been campaigns of nationalism or campaigns which are pandering to people who are feeling as if they're hopeless. They want the system to change. And you spoke about Donald Trump before and how he seems like he's a good guy on the surface. I mean, well, let's look and see if he's actually a good guy. And was it just all the neocons which were pushing him around, or can he make an active decision? For a long time, I think during the Obama era, people sort of lost faith in politics. People were starting to lose faith in politics. And then what we saw afterwards is the likes of Donald Trump would rise, and he was talking about the deep state and I'm going to investigate this, and whatever conspiracy theory you had, he was talking about it. He was talking about, I want to expose this, I want to talk about this.
The swamp.
Yes, I'm going to drain the swamp. But then he just, he might have drained the swamp, and then he just got everybody.
In and started swimming.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, when we have politicians who know what the people are wanting to hear, especially in the information age, they know what we're looking at online. They know what conspiracy theories we have online now. So they have to be more smart if they want to engage us as well, because people largely were losing faith in the political system. So how do you get them re-engaged in the political system, give them these figureheads, and tell them things that they want to hear? And then when they get into office, as always, you'll get that your politicians lie to you.
And such a young man. Now, another young man, colleague of yours, is Robert Carter, who is campaigning for the lifting of the sanctions on Iran. He's got a great petition going. Earlier, I spoke to him on the Skype too. Take a look. Now, Robert Carter, you started with your friends a petition in the United Kingdom to get sanctions lifted on Iran. What response did you get?
Let's take where we are now, the UK, an online petition founded by activists who are trying to apply pressure to alleviate some sanctions just temporarily on Iran in order to help them in their fight back against this outbreak. They started a petition towards the British government, which gained over 13,000 signatures. And that forced the government to respond. After a UK government petition reaches past 10k signatures, then they have to respond. And then if it passes 100,000 signatures, then it will go for a debate. The UK government responded to this petition. They claimed that there was no evidence that sanctions against Iran are hampering their effort to fight COVID-19 at all. And this comes off of the back of banking transactions and also the purchase of millions of face masks from the UK, which of course was blocked in the same month. So it's absolutely outrageous that the UK would make this claim. I think that it proves that, Iran is not getting the support that other countries are getting in order to fight this outbreak. So the fact that they've actually been able to put up a decent effort building brand new hospital facilities to treat patients, they're producing their own medical equipment and drugs domestically, including own domestically made testing kits. Now, if you go to the West again, the UK is also incredibly heavily criticized for its slow response to the outbreak, for starters, the fact that it's still at this stage not providing the protection and the support to its own National Health Service that it needs, and also the fact that they've now entered into a waiting queue for the same medical equipment that Iran has been producing domestically now, including testing kits, masks, and things like that. So what you find is a situation growing now where those countries which didn't help Iran to begin with may now or could now benefit from trade with Iran, which is now producing many of the equipments needed in order to protect health professionals. But again, those US sanctions would prohibit that. So I think if you're going to turn this debate on its head, rather than just blaming the Iranians time and time again, you have to look at Iran and say, look, they're one of the worst hit countries in the world. They're also under the most intense sanctions, but they're still leading the fight back in order to defeat this outbreak. And I think that going forward, once Iran starts to get a grip on the cases and lowering its figures, we may actually be in a position where we would like to purchase many medical equipments and testing kits and drugs from Iran in order to help us fight the outbreak here in the West, where we're struggling to do so. But again, those Western sanctions are going to get in the way and hamper that effort. So for me, I would spend less time blaming the Iranians, which are doing their utmost to fight this outbreak, literally fighting on the front lines against this deadly disease. And I would start criticizing those who are hampering the effort, because the World Health Organization is literally saying that this is a time to put aside political differences and all come together as a human race to help combat one of the most deadly outbreaks that we've ever seen in modern human history. It certainly could be the most deadly within just a few months' time. But unfortunately, you see countries like America and even the UK now using cheap political loopholes in order to avoid helping Iran. And I think that is the real disgrace here.
It is incredible, Shabbir, isn't it? Necessity is the mother of invention. To hear Robert there describe how Iran, under this total siege, is now making its own things that it would otherwise have bought from abroad. Another good example of that is Cuba, isn't it? Which is now sending medics by the thousand around the world, even though Cuba itself has been under siege for 60 years. God works in mysterious ways.
God indeed does work in mysterious ways. And not only that, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, for the last 25 years has been telling the Iranian nation that these sanctions have been a gift from God in many ways, because it has allowed Iran to develop at multi-level, sort of scientifically, intellectually, the knowledge capital on many areas of science and research has exceeded. I think it was only 2 years ago that Iran published the second largest number of scientific papers that were published in the world. So work is going on. Of course, the sanctions have made life difficult, but I think the Iranians have shown that over the last 41 years, since the advent of the revolution, they've had to suffer 8 years of war with Iraq, continuous sanctions, all kinds of other problems, and the whole nation being surrounded by American forces, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, in the Gulf region, and in the former southern Russian state. So America has bases, and even then, Iran is surviving. And just to give you one sort of anecdote evidence, I was in Tehran last time, a couple of years ago, but before that, about 3 years ago, I was in Iran, and there was an exhibition taking place at the Tehran exhibitions halls, which have now been converted into hospitals, which you might have read. Now, there were 300 companies and in educational institutes and universities which were doing work on nanotechnology in Iran itself. Stem cell research, Iran is probably the #1 country on stem cell research at this moment. So I think at the end of the day, George, belief in God is the ultimate victor. And I think Iran does have a belief in God, and no matter the secularists or whatever may make a joke and a mockery that God is not helping in Iran at this moment, but the reality is that God does help, and medicine. And there was a sort of fantastic during the recent crisis, I saw a nice poster somewhere in Africa about doctors. It says, doctors take care, God cures. So at the end of the day, God will provide a cure for this.
Inshallah. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us, and especially the viewers of Kalima Horra. I hope you found it an interesting show, different to our normal shows. I hope that normal service can be resumed soon. Stay safe. I've been George Galloway, and you have been a marvelous audience.